yearly checkup. You know, some jobs require you to go to the doctor once a year and get a physical and be checked up. Because quite frankly, we ignore the body's check engine lights. There's something wrong and we're like, it'll be all right. I'm not going to worry about it until something goes catastrophically wrong. And so that's kind of what I want to talk to us about today is there's times in our spiritual life when we have the opportunity to say, why is the check engine light on? What's going on? One trait of effective people is that they regularly evaluate themselves. They pause for a reflective look at what they're doing, and they say, how can I be better? Now, this is not normal for people. We like to avoid evaluations. We like to avoid the doctor because we don't want to somebody say, like my doctor told me, do you know what this number is? And I said, yes, that's my BMI. It means I'm too short. And she said, exactly. Right. But we don't like to be told there's areas that we need to work on. And so we tend to avoid this evaluation. We just go through life ignoring the things that are there. In 2008, we saw at least 5 high-profile moral failures in the Christian world. I think there may have been more than that just didn't hit the news, but I could figure out 5 of them when I was doing research for this. And one thing that's always lacking about that is honest accountability. They don't have the accountability in place, but also a failure to take an honest, introspective look at your life and say, what do I need to work on? Where can I be better? If you will, open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're continuing in our series about remember, a time to remember things, to stop and remember something that God did. So the holidays are a perfect time to do that because we celebrate something that God did. That's what the holidays are for, a day of remembering what God has done. And so we notice that those are times for celebration. We notice that those were times for declaring the goodness of God, that they would give us anticipation. If God has done this in the past, He will do this in the future. He kept His promises. He will keep His promises. And all of that is helpful during the time of the holidays. Well, today I also want us to notice that the holidays are a time for reflection. And one thing that we practice on a regular basis, a thing that we do to remember something that God did for us, is the Lord's Supper. And so here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is writing to the church that has a lot of problems. This is just one of many of their problems. And he's talking to them about how they are not doing the Lord's Supper properly. They're doing it with wrong motivations. We're going to start in verse 23, and it says, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which He was betrayed, took bread. And when He had given thanks, He broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, He took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he does not judge the body rightly. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep. But if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord, so that we will not be condemned along with the world. So then, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that you will not come together for judgment. The remaining matters I will arrange when I come." So Paul reminds them of the creation of the Lord's Supper and this time of remembering and what it's supposed to mean in their church. There's a few things that I want us to notice as we look through this particular celebration. The first thing that I want you to notice is the purpose of this celebration. Why do we do this? As churches, why do we, honestly, if you were just to walk into a place and you had no background whatsoever, isn't that kind of weird? Because we don't give you enough to eat. It's just kind of like a ritual. And people look at it and they go, what does that mean? So why do we do that? What's the purpose of this particular celebration? Well, Paul reminds the Corinthian church that the Lord's Supper celebration is from the night that Jesus was arrested. Jesus was celebrating the Passover with his disciples, and he establishes this new celebration. I think the how, just like last week we talked about, the how is just as important as the why. And so when he does this, I think there's some purposes in why we do it. The celebration, he says, is a remembrance of the new covenant. 3 times there he said, do this in remembrance of me, do this in remembrance of me. Every time you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So it is a time of remembering. It's a time of looking back and saying, this is what God did for us. And so when you do that, it should be a somber celebration. It should be an introspective celebration because you are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. See, that's really the key to understanding this. This is a time to stop and consider Jesus' death. A broken body. Shed blood. You see, I think a lot of times we like to tell the Christmas story. I went to a Christmas pageant. I don't know if pageant's the right word. It was a play with a guy. And when we got done, I said, so what did you think? He said, there was a little too much Easter in it. I think that's why Christmas is valid and important, is because of Easter. But at the same time, when we come around to Easter, what do we tend to celebrate? The resurrection. Do you ever stop to contemplate the death of Jesus? The broken body and the shed blood. I think when we celebrate the resurrection, it should be a time of celebration. When we celebrate Christmas, it should be a time of celebration. The Advent is an exciting season. But when we stop to think about the death of Jesus, it ought to be somber. It ought to be introspective because Jesus bled and died for us. As a kid growing up in church, I wasn't exactly aware of the purpose of what was going on at communion. And we did it every so often, and I knew it was a quiet and serious time, but I want to be very clear and make sure everybody understands. Partaking in the Lord's Supper is not a ritual that saves you. It is not imparting grace in any way, shape, or form. It is symbolic. It is meant to remind us about something, not give us something. Does that make sense? So it's not a ritual that saves us. It's not required for salvation. This is not imparting grace. It's symbolic. The bread or the cracker reminds us of Jesus' body that was broken for us. The fruit of the vine, the grape, reminds us that the blood was shed for us. The method is what's important. You have broken bread, broken body. You have shed blood, the wine or the grape juice. That is all a picture of what Jesus did for us. And so when you take the time to consider those things and remember what Jesus did, it should help us. It should make us think of ourselves and we say, why did Jesus die? Why did Jesus suffer? Why did he go through that? He did that because of my sin. He did that because of your sin. And when we take the time to remember that, we celebrate the Lord's Supper. So it is a reminder, it is symbolic to remind us of the death of Jesus. And so if that's what its purpose is, why is it so significant? It's really a big deal in a lot of places, and that's kind of an important time for a lot of Christians. When I was in Bible college, we of course go through and we practice all these things, and we talk about baptism, and we talk about Lord's Supper, and of course everybody has their little stories of things that don't go quite right. Just this past week this semester in my classes, we were talking about the Lord's Supper, and a guy tells the story of when he was in a church and they were passing it out, they ran out. And they get down to the very end, and there was one lady who didn't get some. And she threw a fit. Stomping her feet, well, I'm supposed to have some, and you should have done this. He said, I didn't know what to do. He said, should I give it to her because her heart's obviously not right? Or should I just, what do you do? There's things that happen like that. And, but one of the things that we were talking about is what times have communion been very special for you? There was a lady who plays piano, and she says that watching people and being a part of that was important to her. There was another guy that talked about the first time he ever took communion. There was one guy that talked about a church member who had been a long-time faithful church member who was in the hospital and couldn't get to church. And he took communion to him, and that was a very special time for them. So even though it's symbolic, it's very significant. And I think we need to understand the significance of it. If you continue reading here, Paul, after he gives them why they set it up, he says, therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat the bread and drink the cup. Why is this a big deal? Paul wrote that some people were suffering because this is serious stuff. It's symbolic. So why are people weak, sick, and dying? I think it has to do with the introspective nature of the celebration. Paul clearly points out that the ceremony is intended to create self-examination. He says you need to examine yourself and then take it. The heart issue is at stake. Partaking with the wrong motivation and the wrong understanding actually condemns you. Now let me explain what I mean by that. He says at the end, every time you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. A proclamation, a statement about the death of Jesus. This means two very specific things. Number one, those who belong to Jesus are forgiven. How am I forgiven? Because of the death of Jesus. That's one thing that's very, very clear. The second thing that is very clear, then very specific when you proclaim the Lord's death is those who are not His are condemned. So when we talk about the death of Jesus, it separates people. Either you are a believer and a Christian or you are not. It's those two very specific things that you're making a declaration about. So if you make the declaration and you're not His, you are actually condemning yourself. So when you stand and you say, oh, it's just grape juice and cracker, what does it matter? No, you're proclaiming the Lord's death. And the Lord's death, if you've not become a believer, is condemnation on you. Because nobody comes to the Father except through the Son. So this is a very significant celebration, an important time in the life of each believer. We must take it seriously and honestly evaluate yourself. I usually ask myself two questions. Number one, am I His? Well, I go back to that day when I made the decision for Him. And I base it on His promises. And I know I am His. This morning, if you are not His, you have an opportunity to become His. Okay? That's the first thing you need to ask. The second thing is, if you are a believer and you know you're a believer, you need to ask, is there anything that I need to repent of? Is my life lining up like it should be? If it's not, now's the time to get right. See, that's the great thing about God. It doesn't matter how far away you've got. As soon as you turn around in repentance, He's right there. You don't have to run all the way back. He's right there. So you can get right with God right here, right now, before you take communion. And so it's an opportunity to look into that. And so it does need to be serious. It does need to be a time of introspection. And you look at yourself. You must respect the celebration. It's not a time for joking. It's not a time for overindulgence. See, what was happening in the Corinthian church is that it had just become another practice. It was just something else that they were doing. The rich people were coming early while the poor people were still working, and they were overindulging, and it was just something that they did. It lost all its significance. It's significant because of what it means. The Lord's Supper can easily become a traditional ritual void of its meaning. Every time should be meaningful. That's the impact. The impact is not in the practice, it's in the person. And so there's time to remember, and he says you should do it honestly, you should do it for real, because God does not take things lightly. I think we've forgotten in the American church that there was a couple who sold some property in the book of Acts. They came to the church and they acted like they were giving it all to him. God said, "Oh, that's okay. I know your heart is in it," right? No, he killed them. I think we forget that. And Paul says, some of you Christians are acting a fool, and God is judging you for that. This is an opportunity. The Lord's Supper is an opportunity for you to look in your life, evaluate yourself, and get right with God. It's an opportunity for that. So that it is very, very significant. We see the purpose is the remembrance of Jesus, the proclamation of His death, but it's significant to us because every time we do that, we remember what put Jesus on the cross. That was my sin. If that's never been forgiven, it needs to be taken care of. And if there's sin in my life that needs to be repented of, that needs to be taken care of. Because I cannot hold hands with sin and Jesus at the same time. You have to get that taken care of. So we see the purpose, we see the significance, but here's the last thing that I want to point out to you. What's the application of the celebration? Verse 33, Paul says, "So then, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together for judgment, the remaining matters I will arrange when I come." You see, I kind of explained it already, but the particular problem that they were having in this church is that there were people coming beforehand and they were engorging, they were indulging in themselves and getting everything that they want. And then when the poor people who didn't have that opportunity came to church later, there was nothing left for them. So they weren't doing it together. They weren't doing it with its purpose. The inconsistency missed the purpose. It missed the significance. What was being practiced was not a reminder of Jesus, but a social gathering for the elite. It was their ritual that got them into heaven, or their ritual that made them right with God, that some of the other non-elites didn't have the opportunity and the privilege to partake in. The greatest reminder here is found in verse 33. "So then, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another." No matter our social standing, we all approach the cross on the same level. And we should do so in unity. I don't care who you are, how many people you've influenced, how rich you may be, we all come to the cross on the same level. A sinner in need of grace. And so we should do that. When we come to the death of Jesus, when we come to remember that, social standing doesn't mean anything. You know, our society is set up to elevate the elite. Let me explain. Back when Sharon and I were dating, we've been together forever. But back when we were boyfriend and girlfriend in high school, we went to a concert at the Rib Fest. Who did we go see?
Tim McGraw.
No, I did not see Tim McGraw. Black Hawk. Black Hawk. We went to Rib Fest. That was your other boyfriend. You went to Tim McGraw. We went to see Black Hawk, but we went to Rib Fest. The Rib Fest down in North Carolina is held at the Walnut Creek Amphitheater, and they have all the people that do ribs, and you can buy the different ribs and you can try it, but they have these concerts that happen throughout the day. Well, I had some connections, and I got us VIP tickets, which means we had VIP parking, and we had VIP seats. So we were sitting in the VIP section. Obviously, we did not fit in there. But we were there in the VIP seating, and everybody treated us special. We were treated like somebody who had connections and somebody who knew somebody, and it was the VIP treatment. And so that's the way our society tends to do. If somebody is affluent, if somebody has money, they tend to get special treatment. Paul talks about that, and he says, don't do that. Don't do that in the church. This is one particular application where they're seeing that happening. You know, and it doesn't just happen there. I think we all tend to be that way. Everybody in here, me included, believes the rules don't include us. The rules are for the stupid people, not for me. Right? We all do that. We go somewhere and we're like, oh, that's the rules, but that's for people who don't have common sense or people who aren't, as good as I am. And so I can break those rules because I understand the purpose of the rule. That's for people who don't have self-control or don't have common sense. That's not for me. We tend to like to have that elite status, and so when we get the privilege to do something, we think of it that way. But I think we need to remember, no one gets to heaven except that they come through the cross, broken, humility, pleading for the grace of God. Because God is not a respecter of persons. He doesn't care how much money you have. He doesn't care how many people you know. He doesn't care how smart you are. He is no respecter of persons. What we find impressive about people is nothing to God. What He sees is a sinner. What He sees is somebody who has broken His commandments. I think we forget that sometimes, and that's why we need a reminder on a regular basis that Jesus died because of my sin. That's the application. When we look at this, it's a reminder. Oh, I'm a good Christian. I do this, I do that. You see, sometimes I think we forget where we really stand and what really gets us where we are. And I think that's the problem we're seeing. Some Christians are more concerned about defending their liberties than demonstrating their love. If more believers put as much time and energy into fulfilling the Great Commission as they do about exercising their own personal rights, I think we would see the book of Acts instead of reading about ourselves in the letters of the book of Revelation, where he says, you've left your first love. We've got the potential. We've got the opportunity. I think we need to be faced with the death of Jesus on a regular basis to evaluate ourselves and say, I know I'm not good enough. I know where I stand. I stand in need of grace. Today, if you've never made that decision, I encourage you to come talk to me. Get that settled. Get that straightened out. If you are a believer here today, we're going to offer you some opportunities to think about that before and as we pass out the celebration of the Lord's Supper. It is serious business, and it is something we do thinking about it. If you really do want to get serious with God, if you're serious about getting serious with God, here's 2 books that I highly recommend. One is Returning to Holiness. Eddie Smith read it and said, well, he's meddling a little bit. What that means is he asks some tough questions, and he'll step on your toes a little bit and make you think. This other one here is 10 Questions to Diagnose Your Spiritual Health, another really good book. He goes through and he talks about spiritual disciplines and how you're practicing those in your life and what they bring out. But if you're serious about getting serious with God, those are some good books. But we'll have an opportunity now to take some introspective look, to think about ourselves, to remember why we celebrate. I'm going to ask Jake to come up and help us. Sharon's going to start some music here. We'll give you a few minutes.